Life Sarah Baartman, called Saartjie, the diminutive form, was likely born in 1789 in the Gamtoos Valley in the eastern part of the Cape Colony. In 1810, she went to England with her employer, a free black man, a Cape designation for someone of slave descent, called Hendrik Caesars, and William Dunlop, an English doctor who worked at the Cape Slave Lodge. They sought to show her for money on the London stage. Sarah Baartman spent 4 years on stage in England and Ireland. Early on, her treatment on the Piccadilly stage caught the attention of British abolitionists, who argued that her performance was indecent and that she was being forced to perform against her will. Ultimately, the court ruled in favor of her exhibition after Dunlop produced a contract made between himself and Baartman. It is doubtful that this contract was valid. It was probably produced for the purposes of the trial. Caesars left the show and Dunlop continued to display Baartman in country fairs. Baartman also moved to Manchester where she was baptized as Sarah Baartman. In 1814, after Dunlop's death, a man called Henry Taylor brought Baartman to Paris. He sold her to an animal trainer, S. Rowe, who made her amuse onlookers who frequented the Palais Royal. Georges Cuvier, founder and professor of comparative anatomy at the Museum of Natural History, examined Baartman as he searched for proof of a so-called missing link between animals and human beings. Baartman's body became the foundation for racist science. Baartman lived in poverty, and died in Paris of an undetermined inflammatory disease in December 1815. After her death, Cuvier dissected her body, and displayed her remains. For more than a century and a half, visitors to the Museum of Man in Paris could view her brain, skeleton and genitalia as well as a plaster cast of her body. Her remains were returned to South Africa in 2002 and she was buried in the Eastern Cape on South Africa's Women's Day. Early life in South Africa. Sarah Baartman was born to a Khoisan family in the vicinity of the Gamtoos River in what is now the Eastern Cape of South Africa, on land taken over by Dutch farmers. Her father was killed by Bushmen while driving cattle. Saartjie is the diminutive form of Sarah. In Cape Dutch, the use of the diminutive form commonly indicated familiarity, endearment or contempt. Her birth name is unknown. Baartman spent her childhood and teenage years on settler farms. She went through puberty rites, and kept the small tortoise-shell necklace, probably given to her by her mother, until her death in France. In the 1790s, a free black, the Cape designation for individuals of enslaved descent, trader named Peter Caesars met her and encouraged her to move to Cape Town, which had recently come under British control. Records do not show whether she was made to leave, or went willingly, or was sent by her family to Caesars. She lived in Cape Town for at least 2 years working in households as a washerwoman and a nursemaid, first for Peter Caesars, then in the house of a Dutch man in Cape Town. She moved finally to be a wet nurse in the household of Peter Caesars' brother-in-law, Hendrik Caesars, outside of Cape Town in present-day Woodstock. Sarah Baartman lived alongside slaves in the Caesars household. As someone of Khoisan descent, she could not be formally enslaved, but probably lived in conditions similar to slaves in Cape Town. There is evidence that she had 2 children, though both died as babies. She had a relationship with a poor European military man, Hendrik van Jong, who lived in Hout Bay near Cape Town, but the relationship ended when his regiment left the Cape. William Dunlop, a Scottish military surgeon in the Cape Slave Lodge, with a sideline in supplying showmen in Britain with animal specimens, suggested she travel to England to make money by exhibition. Baartman refused. Dunlop persisted and Sarah Baartman said she would only go if Hendrik Caesars came too. He also refused, but became ever more in debt in part because of unfavorable lending terms because of his status as free black. Finally, in 1810 he agreed to go to England to make money through putting Sarah Baartman on stage. The party left for London in 1810. It is unknown if Sarah Baartman went willingly or was forced, but she was in no position to refuse even if she chose to do so. On show in Great Britain. Hendrik Caesars and Alexander Dunlop brought Baartman to London in 1810. The group lived together in Duke Street, St. James, the most expensive part of London. In the household were Sarah Baartman, Hendrik Caesars, Alexander Dunlop, and 2 African boys, probably brought illegally by Dunlop from the slave lodge in Cape Town. Dunlop schemed to have Sarah exhibited and Caesars was the showman. Dunlop exhibited Baartman in the Egyptian Hall of Piccadilly Circus on November 24, 1810. Dunlop thought he could make money because of landowners' lack of familiarity with Africans and because of Baartman's large bottom. Crace and Scully say, people came to see her because they saw her not as a person but as a pure example of this one part of the natural world. She lived in the occupation of a cook at the Cape of Good Hope. Her country is situated not less than 600 miles from the Cape, the inhabitants of which are rich in cattle and sell them by barter for a mere trifle, a bottle of brandy, or small roll of tobacco will purchase several sheep. Their principal trade is in cattle skins or tallow. Beyond this nation is another, of small stature, very subtle and fierce. The Dutch could not bring them under subjection, and shot them whenever they found them. 9th Janey, 1811. HC. The tradition of freak shows was long-standing in Britain at this time, and historians have argued that this is at first how Baartman was displayed. Baartman never allowed herself to be exhibited nude, and an account of her appearance in London in 1810 makes it clear that she was wearing a garment, albeit a tight-fitting one. Her exhibition in London just a few years after the passing of the Slave Trade Act 1807 created a scandal. This is in part because British audiences misread Hendrik Caesars, thinking he was a Dutch farmer, Boer, from the frontier. Scholars have tended to reproduce that error, but tax rolls at the Cape show he was free black. Violence was part of the show. An abolitionist benevolent society called the African Association conducted a newspaper campaign for her release. Zachary Macaulay led the protest. Hendrik Caesars protested that Baartman was entitled to earn her living, stating, "Has she not as good a right to exhibit herself as an Irish giant or a dwarf?" Caesars was comparing Baartman to the contemporary Irish giants Charles Byrne and Patrick Cotter O'Brien. Macaulay and the African Association took the matter to court, and on November 24, 1810 at the Court of King's Bench the Attorney General began the attempt to give her liberty to say whether she was exhibited by her own consent. In support he produced two affidavits in court. The first, from a Mr. Bullock of Liverpool Museum, was intended to show Baartman had been brought to Britain by persons who referred to her as if she were property. The second, by the Secretary of the African Association, described the degrading conditions under which she was exhibited and also gave evidence of coercion. Baartman was then questioned before an attorney in Dutch, in which she was fluent, via interpreters. However, the conditions of the interview were stacked against her, in part again because the court saw Hendrik Caesars as the Boer exploiter, rather than seeing Alexander Dunlop as the organizer. They thus ensured that Caesars was not in the room when Baartman made her statement, but Dunlop was allowed to remain. Historians have stated that this therefore casts great doubt on the veracity and independence of the statement that Baartman then made. She stated that she in fact was not under restraint, did not get sexually abused, and that she came to London on her own free will. She also did not wish to return to her family and understood perfectly that she was guaranteed half of the profits. The case was therefore dismissed. She was questioned for 3 hours. The statements directly contradict accounts of her exhibitions made by Zachary Macaulay of the African Institution and other eyewitnesses. A written contract was produced, which is considered by some modern commentators to be a legal subterfuge. The publicity given by the court case increased Baartman's popularity as an exhibit. She later toured other parts of England and was exhibited at a fair in Limerick, Ireland in 1812. She also was exhibited at a fair at Bury St Edmunds in Suffolk. On the 1st of December 1811 Baartman was baptized at Manchester Cathedral, and there is evidence that she was married on the same day. Later life in France. A man called Henry Taylor took Sarah Baartman to France, from around September 1814. Taylor then sold her to an animal trainer, Sartjie, who exhibited her under more pressured conditions for 15 months at the Palais Royal. In France she was in effect enslaved. In Paris, her exhibition became more clearly entangled with scientific racism. French scientists were curious about whether she had the elongated labia which earlier naturalists such as François Levaillant had purportedly observed in Coison at the Cape. French naturalists, among them Georges Cuvier, head keeper of the menagerie at the Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle, and founder of the discipline of comparative anatomy, visited her. She was the subject of several scientific paintings at the Jardin du Roi, where she was examined in March 1815, as Saint Hilaire and Ric Cuvier, a younger brother of Georges, reported. She was obliging enough to undress and to allow herself to be painted in the nude. This was not literally true, although by his standards she appeared to be naked. In accordance with her own cultural norms of modesty throughout these sessions she wore a small apron-like garment which concealed her genitalia. She steadfastly refused to remove this even when offered money by one of the attending scientists. 131 to 134 in Paris, Baartman's promoters didn't need to concern themselves with slavery charges. Crace and Scully state, by the time she got to Paris, her existence was really quite miserable and extraordinarily poor. Sarah was literally treated like an animal. There is some evidence to suggest that at one point a collar was placed around her neck. Death and legacy. Baartman died on the 29th of December 1815 at age 26, of an undetermined inflammatory ailment, possibly smallpox, while other sources suggest she contracted syphilis, or pneumonia. Cuvier conducted a dissection, but did not do an autopsy to inquire into the reasons for Baartman's death. French anatomist Henri-Marie Ducrotay de Blainville published notes on the dissection in 1816, which were republished by Georges Cuvier in the Memoirs du Muséum d'Histoire Naturelle in 1817. Cuvier, who had met Baartman, notes in his monograph that its subject was an intelligent woman with an excellent memory, particularly for faces. In addition to her native tongue, she spoke fluent Dutch, passable English, and a smattering of French. He describes her shoulders and back as graceful, arms slender, hands and feet as charming and pretty. He adds she was adept at playing the Jew's harp, could dance according to the traditions of her country, and had a lively personality. Despite this, Cuvier interpreted her remains, in accordance with his theories on racial evolution, as evidencing ape-like traits. He thought her small ears were similar to those of an orangutan and also compared her vivacity, when alive, to the quickness of a monkey. From the 1940s, there were sporadic calls for the return of her remains. A poem written in 1978 by Deanna Ferris, herself of Khoisan descent, entitled I've Come to Take You Home, played a pivotal role in spurring the movement to bring Baartman's remains back to her birth soil. The case gained worldwide prominence only after Stephen Jay Gould wrote The Mismeasure of Man in the 1980s. Mansell Upham, a researcher and jurist specializing in South African colonial history, also helped spur the movement to bring Baartman's remains back to South Africa. After the victory of the African National Congress in the South African general election, 1994, President Nelson Mandela formally requested that France return the remains. After much legal wrangling and debates in the French National Assembly, France acceded to the request on 6 March 2002. Her remains were repatriated to her homeland, the Gamtoos Valley, on 6 May 2002, and they were buried on 9 August 2002 on Vergaderingscoop, a hill in the town of Hankie over 200 years after her birth. Baartman became an icon in South Africa as representative of many aspects of the nation's history. The Saartjie Baartman Center for Women and Children, a refuge for survivors of domestic violence, opened in Cape Town in 1999. South Africa's first offshore environmental protection vessel, the Sarah Baartman, is also named after her. Symbolism. However, Sarah Baartman is not the only cocoa to be taken from her homeland. Her story is always used as a symbol to illustrate various social and political strains, and through these applications, her true story has been lost among the discussions. Dr. Yvette Abraham, Professor of Women and Gender Studies at the University of the Western Cape, says, "We lack academic studies that view Sarah Baartman as anything other than a symbol. Her story becomes marginalized, as it is always used to illustrate some other topic. For some reason, Baartman is always employed to represent African discrimination and suffering in the West, even though there were many other Cocoa people who were taken to Europe. For example, historian Neil Parsons writes about two Cocoa children of 13 and 6 who were taken from South Africa and displayed at a holiday fair in Elberfeld, Germany, 1845. Secondly, a traveling show called The Boshemans traveled around Britain, Ireland, and France, consisting of 2 men, women, and 1 baby. The circus was in business from 1846 to 1855. Thirdly, P.T. Barnum's show, called Little People, advertised a 16-year-old girl by the name of Flora as the missing link and acquired 6 more Cocoa children after her. These are just some of the cases of Cocoa Africans who were enslaved and put on display in the West. There may be some reason as to why Baartman's tale is so famous. She was the first Cocoa to be taken from her homeland. However, instead of being the first, it is most likely that her fame is due to the extensive exploitation of her body by the general public and scientists such as Georges Cuvier, as well as the horrible mistreatment she received during and after her life. She was brought to the West solely on the premise of her exaggerated female form, and the European public found a sickening obsession with her reproductive organs. Her body parts were on display at the Musée de l'Homme for 150 years, and her story as a symbol may be due to the awareness and sympathy it has evoked in the public eye. Even though Baartman was the first Cocoa to land in Europe, much of her story has been lost, and she is instead defined by her tragic utilization and exploitation in the West. Her body as a foundation for scientific racism. Julian Joseph Vire used Sarah Baartman's published image to validate racial typologies. In his essay, Dictionnaire des Sciences Médicales, Dictionary of Medical Sciences, he summarizes the true nature of the black female within the framework of accepted medical discourse. Vire focused on identifying her sexual organs as more developed and distinct in comparison to white female organs. All of his theories regarding sexual primitivism are influenced and supported by the anatomical studies and illustrations of Sarah Baartman, which were created by Georges Cuvier. In cartoons and drawings, Baartman's features were often exaggerated to highlight her difference from European females. This social construction of visual imagery likely amplified and reinforced racist perspectives. Little of this knowledge can be considered completely factual, as most knowledge of Baartman is not extrapolated from diverse sources of documentation. Sexism. During 1814 to 70, there were at least 7 scientific descriptions of the body bodies of women of color done in comparative anatomy. Cuvier's dissection of Baartman helped shape European science. Baartman, along with several other African women who were dissected, were referred to as Hottentots, or sometimes bush women. The savage woman was seen as very distinct from the civilized female of Europe, thus 19th century scientists were fascinated by the Hottentot Venus. In the 1800s, people in London were able to pay 2 shillings apiece to gaze upon her body in wonder. Baartman was considered a freak of nature. For extra pay, one could even poke her with a stick or finger. Sarah Baartman's organs, genitalia and buttocks were thought to be evidence of her sexual primitivism and intellectual equality with that of an orangutan. 131 to 134 Colonialism There has been much speculation and study about colonialist influence that relates to Baartman's name, social status, her illustrated and performed presentation as the Hottentot Venus, and the negotiation for her body's return to her homeland. These components and events in Baartman's life have been used by activists and theorists to determine the ways in which 19th-century European colonists exercised control and authority over Coco people and simultaneously crafted racist and sexist ideologies about their culture. In addition to this, recent scholars have begun to analyze the surrounding events leading up to Baartman's return to her homeland and conclude that it is an expression of recent contemporary post-colonial objectives. Many scholars have presented information on how Baartman's life was heavily controlled and manipulated by colonialist and patriarchal language. 131 to 134 Baartman grew up on a farm. There is no historical documentation of her indigenous Khoisan name. She was given the Dutch name Saartjie by Dutch colonists who occupied the land she lived on during her childhood. According to Clifton Crace and Pamela Scully, her first name is the Cape Dutch form for Sarah, which marked her as a colonialist servant. Saartjie, the diminutive, was also a sign of affection. Encoded in her first name were the tensions of affection and exploitation. Her surname literally means bearded man in Dutch. It also means uncivilized, uncouth, barbarous, savage. Saartjie Baartman, the savage servant. 9. Dutch colonizers also bestowed the term Hottentot, which is derived from Hottentot, Dutch approximations of common sounds in the Khoi language. The Dutch used this word when referencing Khoi people because of the clicking sounds and staccato pronunciations that characterize the Khoi language. These components of the Khoi language were considered strange and bestial to Dutch colonizers. The term was used until the 20th century, at which point most people understood its effect as a derogatory term. Travelogues that circulated in Europe would describe Africa as being uncivilized and lacking regard for religious virtue. Travelogues and imagery depicting black women as sexually primitive and savage enforced the belief that it was in Africa's best interest to be colonized by European settlers. Cultural and religious conversion was considered to be an altruistic act with imperialist undertones. Colonizers believed that they were reforming and correcting Khoisan culture in the name of the Christian faith and empire. During the lengthy negotiation to have Baartman's body returned to her home country after her death, the assistant curator of Musée de l'Homme, Philippe Menessier, argued against her return, stating, "We never know what science will be able to tell us in the future. If she is buried, this chance will be lost, for as she remains a very important treasure." According to Sadia Qureshi, due to the continued treatment of Baartman's body as a cultural artifact, Philippe Menessier's statement is contemporary evidence of the same type of ideology that surrounded Baartman's body while she was alive in the 18th century. Feminist reception Traditional iconography of Sarah Baartman and feminist contemporary art Many African female diasporic artists have criticized the traditional iconography of Baartman. According to the studies of contemporary feminists, traditional iconography and historical illustrations of Baartman are effective in revealing the ideological representation of black women in art throughout history. Such studies assess how the traditional iconography of the black female body was institutionally and scientifically defined in the 19th century. Renee Cox, Renee Green, Joyce Scott, Lorna Simpson, Cara Mae Weems and Deborah Willis are artists who seek to investigate contemporary social and cultural issues that still surround the African female body. Sander Gilman, a cultural and literary historian, states, while many groups of African blacks were known to Europeans in the 19th century, the Hottentot remained representative of the essence of the black, especially the black female. Both concepts fulfilled the iconographic function in the perception and representation of the world. Lyle Ashton Harris and Renee Valerie Cox worked in collaboration to produce the photographic piece Hottentot Venus 2000. In this piece, Harris photographs Victoria Cox, who presents herself as Baartman while wearing large, sculptural, gold, metal breasts and buttocks attached to her body. According to Deborah Willis, the paraphernalia attached to Cox's body are markers for the way in which Baartman's sexual body parts were essential for her constructed role or function as the Hottentot Venus. Willis also explains that Cox's side-angle shot makes reference to the scientific, traditional propaganda used by Cuvier and Julian Joseph Virey, who sourced Baartman's traditional illustrations and iconography to publish their scientific findings. Reviewers of Harrison Cox's work have commented that the presence of the gaze in the photograph of Cox presents a critical engagement with previous traditional imagery of Baartman. Bell Hooks has elaborated further on the function of the gaze. The gaze has been and is a site of resistance for colonized black people globally. Subordinates in relations of power learn experientially that there is a critical gaze, one that looks to document, one that is oppositional. In resistance struggle, the power of the dominated to assert agency by claiming and cultivating awareness politicizes looking relations. One learns to look a certain way in order to resist. Permitted is an installation piece created by Renee Samwise Green inspired by Sarah Baartman. Green created a specific viewing arrangement to investigate the European perception of the black female body as exotic, bizarre and monstrous. Viewers were prompted to step onto the installed platform, which was meant to evoke a stage where Baartman may have been exhibited. Green recreates the basic setting of Baartman's exhibition. At the center of the platform, which there is a large image of Baartman, and wooden rulers are slats with an engraved caption by Francis Galton encouraging viewers to measure Baartman's buttocks. In the installation there is also a peephole that allows viewers to see an image of Baartman standing on a crate. According to Willis, the implication of the peephole demonstrates how ethnographic imagery of the black female form in the 19th century functioned as a form of pornography for Europeans present at Baartman's exhibit. In her film, Reassemblage, From the Firelight to the Screen, Trinh T. Minh comments on the ethnocentric bias that the colonizer's eye applies to the naked female form. Mina argues that this bias causes the nude female body to be seen as inherently sexually provocative, promiscuous and pornographic within the context of European or Western culture. Feminist artists are interested in re-representing Baartman's image, and work to highlight the stereotypes and ethnocentric bias surrounding the black female body based on art historical representations and iconography that occurred before, after and during Baartman's lifetime. Media representation and feminist criticism In November 2014, Paper magazine released a cover of Kim Kardashian in which she was illustrated as balancing a champagne glass on her extended rear. The cover received much criticism for endorsing the exploitation and fetishism of the black female body. The similarities with the way in which Baartman was represented as the Hottentot Venus during the 19th century have prompted much criticism and commentary. According to writer Geneva S. Thomas, anyone that is aware of black women's history under colonialist influence would consequentially be aware that Kardashian's photo easily elicits memory regarding the visual representation of Baartman. The photographer and director of the photo, Jean-Paul Gaud, based the photo on his previous work Carolina Beaumont, taken of a nude model in 1976 and published in his book Jungle Fever. A People magazine article in 1979 about his relationship with model Grace Jones describes Gaud in the following statement: Jean-Paul has been fascinated with women like Grace since his youth. The son of a French engineer and an American-born dancer, he grew up in a Paris suburb. From the moment he saw West Side Story and the Alvin Ailey dance troupe, he found himself captivated by ethnic minorities, black girls, PRs. I had jungle fever, he now says. Blacks are the premise of my work. Days before the shoot, Gaud often worked with his models to find the best hyperbolized position to take his photos. His model and partner, Grace Jones, would also pose for days prior to finally acquiring the perfect form. That's the basis of my entire work, Gaud states, creating a credible illusion. Similarly, Baartman and other black female slaves were illustrated and depicted in a specific form to identify features, which were seen as proof of ideologies regarding black female primitivism. Display of remains After Baartman's death, Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire applied on behalf of the Muséum d'Histoire Naturelle to retain her corpse on the grounds that it was of singular specimen of humanity and therefore of special scientific interest. The application was approved and Baartman's skeleton and body cast were displayed in Muséum d'Histoire Naturelle d'Angers, where she entertained visitors until her skull was stolen in 1827, and subsequently returned a few months later. The restored skeleton and skull continued to arouse the interest of visitors until the remains were moved to the Musée de l'Homme, when it was founded in 1937, and continued up until the late 1970s. Her body cast and skeleton stood side by side and faced away from the viewer, which emphasized her steatopygia, accumulation of fat on the buttocks, while reinforcing that aspect as the primary primary interest of her body. The Baartman exhibit proved popular until it elicited complaints from feminists who believed the exhibit was a degrading representation of women. The skeleton was removed in 1974, and the body cast in 1976. Cultural references. On the 10th of January 1811, at the New Theatre, London, a pantomime called The Hottentot Venus featured at the end of the evening's entertainment. In William Makepeace Thackeray's 1847 novel Vanity Fair, George Osborne angrily refuses his father's instruction to marry a West Indian mulatto heiress by referring to Miss Swartz as that Hottentot Venus. In Crinolini in 1863, a poem satirizing Victorian fashion, the author compares a woman in a crinoline to a Venus from the Cape. In James Joyce's 1916 novel A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, the protagonist, Stephen Dedalus, refers to the great flanks of Venus after a reference to the Hottentot people, when discussing the discrepancies between cultural perceptions of female beauty. Dame Edith Sitwell referred to her allusively in Hornpipe, a poem in the satirical collection Facade. Elizabeth Alexander explores her story in a 1987 poem and 1990 book, both entitled The Venus Hottentot. Susan Laurie Parks used the story of Baartman as the basis for her 1996 play Venus. Lyle Ashton Harris collaborated with the model Renee Valerie Cox to produce a photographic image, Hottentot Venus 2000. Kathy Park Hong wrote a poem entitled Hottentot Venus in her 2007 book translating MOUM. Lydia R. Diamond's 2008 play Voyeurs de Venus investigates Baartman's life from a post-colonial perspective. A movie entitled Black Venus, directed by Abdelatif Kechiche and starring Yahima Torres as Sarah, was released in 2010. Hendrik Hofmeyr composed a 20-minute opera entitled Saartjie which was to be premiered by Cape Town Opera in November 2010. Douglas Carney published a poem titled Drop It Like It's Hottentot Venus in April 2012. Diane Auerbach has Baartman feature as a central thread in her novel Home Remedies. The work is critical of the grandstanding that so often surrounds Baartman. As Auerbach has explained, Saartjie Baartman is not a symbol. She is a dead woman who once suffered in a series of cruel systems. The best way we can remember her is by not letting it happen again. Brett Bailey's Exhibit B, A Human Zoo, depicts Baartman. See also Oda Benga, Racism in Europe. Footnotes references Clifton Crace and Pamela Scully, 2009. Sarah Baartman and the Hottentot Venus, a ghost story and a biography. Princeton University Press. ISBN 0-691-13580-0. Gilman, Sander L. 1985. Black Bodies, White Bodies, Toward an Iconography of Female Sexuality in Late 19th Century Art, Medicine, and Literature. In Gates, Henry, ed. Race, Writing and Difference 223-261. Chicago, University of Chicago Press. Qureshi, Sadaya, 2004. Displaying Sarah Baartman, the Hottentot Venus, in History of Science 42-233-257. PDF available here. Scully, Pamela and Clifton Crace, 2008. Race and Erasure, Sarah Baartman and Hendrik Caesars in Cape Town and London. In the Journal of British Studies, 47, 02, 301-323. Scully, Pamela, 2010. Peripheral Visions, Heterography and Writing the Transnational Life of Sarah Baartman. In Desley Deacon, Penny Russell, and Angela Woolacott, eds. Transnational Lives. Palgrave Macmillan, 27-40. Willis, Deborah, ed. Black Venus 2010. They Called Her Hottentot. Philadelphia, PA. Temple University Press. ISBN 978-1-4399-0205-9. Further reading Fausto Sterling, Anne, 1995. Gender, Race, and Nation, The Comparative Anatomy of Hottentot Women in Europe, 1815-1817. In Terry, Jennifer and Jacqueline URLA, ed. Deviant Bodies, Critical Perspectives on Difference in Science and Popular Culture, 19-48. Bloomington, Indiana University Press. ISBN 0-253-32898-5. Hobson, Janelle, 2005. Venus in the Dark, Blackness and Beauty in Popular Culture. Routledge. ISBN 978-0-415-97402-8. Holmes, Rachel, 2006. The Hottentot Venus. Bloomsbury, Random House. ISBN 0-7475-7776-5. Qureshi, Sadaya, 2011. Peoples on Parade, Exhibitions, Empire and Anthropology in 19th Century Britain. University of Chicago Press. ISBN 0-2267-0096-8. Ritter, Sabine, 2010. Feesten der Sarah Baartman, Representationen und Rekonstruktionen der Hottentotten Venus. Munster, Lit Verlag. ISBN 3-643-10950-4. Films Abdelatif Kechiche, Venus Noor, Black Venus. Paris, MK2, 2009. 9. Zola Massico, The Life and Times of Sarah Baartman. Icarus, 1998. External links South Africa government site about her, including Diana Ferris's pivotal poem, A French Print. Mara Verna's interactive audio and video piece including a bibliography. Guardian article on the return of her remains. A documentary film called The Life and Times of Sarah Baartman by Zola Massico.